If you ever come near her again, I will destroy everything you touch." Paul's voice cut through the cold night like a warning from a man who had nothing left to lose. Olivia, 7 months pregnant, shivering and abandoned on a freezing street, never expected a stranger, Paul Lancaster, the ruthless billionaire CEO, to pull her into a world she couldn't imagine. But as danger stalks them, secrets unravel, and his obsession grows. Olivia realizes that her safety and her heart are in his hands. Can she survive the night that will change everything? Don't miss the story of love, betrayal, and a father who refuses to let go. Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories. I'm so glad to have you here. Tell me, where are you listening from today? Make sure you stay with me till the very end of this story, because you won't want to miss a single moment. And hey, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories. Now let's dive in. Olivia sat at the edge of the freezing bus stop, her entire body curled inward, as if trying to protect the tiny life growing inside her from the merciless wind that slashed across the empty street like invisible knives. The cold settling so deeply into her bones that even her teeth trembled uncontrollably, despite how tightly she hugged her pregnant belly, her thin hospital scrubs offering absolutely no defense against the brutal night. Her breath came out in uneven, shaky bursts that turned into white clouds in the air, each one a painful reminder of how long she had been sitting there after being thrown out of her apartment, with nothing but a backpack and the uniform she'd been wearing at her shift, her landlord screaming at her while her fiancé, the man she trusted with her future, watched silently, refusing to defend her, refusing to look her in the eyes, refusing to care about the child he helped create. Her tears stung against her skin, instantly cooling into tiny, icy trails as they slid down her cheeks, and she kept wiping them away even though they wouldn't stop, even though a part of her felt she had no right to cry anymore after trusting the wrong man for far too long. She pressed her hands over her belly, whispering shaky reassurance to her unborn child, even as her throat constricted painfully, trying to sound brave when she felt nothing but utter exhaustion, utter betrayal, utter fear, and the unforgiving night only worsened it, swallowing every sound except the violent gusts blasting against the bus shelter. Each car that passed in a blur sent a fresh wave of dread through her. She was alone, vulnerable, exposed, and painfully aware of how dangerous the city could be at this hour, especially for a pregnant woman with nowhere to go. She kept checking her phone, even though she knew the screen would show the same thing every time. No messages, no missed calls, no apology from Tyler, no concern from friends, nothing except the cold glow of a device that reminded her how completely she had been abandoned. A particularly harsh gust slammed against her cheeks, making her wince as her fingers tightened around the thin fabric of her scrubs, and for a dizzy moment she thought she might simply collapse right there on the icy sidewalk, because the cold was numbing everything, even her ability to think clearly. Her vision blurred as the streetlights flickered in the distance, and she forced herself to sit upright, refusing to let herself fall apart, even though her body shook uncontrollably from fatigue, hunger, and the physical drain of pregnancy. She whispered, "Just hold on a little longer," though she wasn't sure who she was talking to, herself or the baby, who kicked weakly inside her, as if sensing her distress. And that faint movement made her chest ache with guilt that her child had to endure this because of her choices, her trust, her mistakes. When headlights emerged slowly through the sheets of cold wind, she tensed instantly, her heart thudding painfully in her chest as a sleek black car rolled silently toward the curb, its engine too smooth, its body too polished to belong in this part of the city at this hour, and her instincts screamed caution even before the vehicle fully stopped beside her. She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the metal bench, her pulse racing as the car idled there in ominous stillness, the tinted windows revealing nothing of who or what was inside. For a second she considered standing, running, doing anything except sitting still like prey, caught in open light, but her legs felt too weak, too heavy, nearly numb from cold, and all she could do was stare as the passenger door opened with quiet precision. When Paul Lancaster stepped out, she froze entirely because the man didn't look like a stranger wandering by chance. He looked like a force stepping deliberately into her world. Tall, impeccably dressed, sharply composed, with an expression carved from ice that carried the intensity of someone who had never been ignored in his life. His presence alone seemed to cut through the cold, not because he was warm, but because he was powerful, controlled, intimidating in a way that made the wind itself hesitate before touching him. Olivia's breath caught as his gaze landed on her, his usual emotionless mask cracking just enough to reveal something startling. Concern, sharp and immediate, flickering across his face like a shadow of a man he didn't often allow himself to be. She had seen him before, briefly, in the hospital halls when he visited his employees or funded new wings, always surrounded by assistants, always distant, always focused, never giving anyone more than a cold nod. But now he stepped closer with precision, his jaw tightening as he took in her soaked scrubs, her trembling hands, her exhausted face, her belly rising and falling beneath the thin fabric, and for the first time in hours she felt seen. Not as a burden, not as someone to judge, but as a human being freezing on a sidewalk. Without a moment of hesitation, he shrugged off his long black coat, the fabric heavy, warm, expensive in a way she had never touched before, and draped it around her shoulders with a firmness that allowed no room for argument. The warmth hit her like a shock, almost painful after so much cold, and she inhaled sharply as heat rushed back into her arms and chest, her eyes widening at the unexpected gentleness of a man known for being unyielding, ruthless, and completely detached from other people's suffering. His voice cut through the wind as he said, steady and commanding, "You stay here another minute, you'll collapse. Come with me." The tone leaving no space for doubt, no room for protest. Olivia shook her head weakly, desperate to cling to some sliver of independence, even though she knew she was falling apart. She whispered, "I'm fine. I just need a minute." But the lie collapsed the moment her legs trembled beneath her, her vision dimming as dizziness rushed in so fast she barely felt the bench slipping away from her touch. She tried to push herself upright, tried to pretend she didn't need help, tried to act like she wasn't on the verge of collapsing in the snow, but the world tilted violently and her knees buckled as darkness tunneled around the edges of her sight. In that split second, before her body surrendered to exhaustion, she felt a flare of panic, fear of falling, fear of hurting her baby, fear of failing even in this. But then a strong arm wrapped around her waist, steady and firm, pulling her into a solid chest that radiated warmth. Paul caught her before she hit the ground, his other hand supporting the back of her head with surprising care, his breath brushing against her cold cheek as he muttered something low, something urgent she couldn't make out. Her consciousness drifted like a fading flame, but she felt his heartbeat through his shirt, strong and quick, as if her collapse had shaken him more than he would ever admit. The world dimmed further, her body leaning helplessly against him, and the last thing she felt before everything went black was his arm tightening protectively around her, as if he had already made a decision he wasn't planning to reverse. In the fading haze, she heard the faint click of a door behind him. Someone else in the car had stepped out, watching them with unreadable intent. She fainted forward, and Paul caught her against his chest before she hit the ground. 2. Olivia drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if rising from the bottom of a dark lake. The last memory she had being the cold tearing through her body and the sensation of collapsing into someone's arms, and for a second she feared she was still on the freezing sidewalk. But when her eyes opened, she found herself wrapped in a cocoon of warmth, nestled beneath impossibly soft blankets in a bed far larger than anything she had ever slept in. the faint golden glow of a bedside lamp casting gentle shadows through a room so elegant it felt unreal, with high ceilings, polished wood floors, cream-colored drapes, and artwork that looked too expensive to even breathe near. Her groggy mind tried to piece everything together, blinking against the soft light, and then she saw him, Paul Lancaster, sitting in a chair at the edge of the bed, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, posture rigid yet strangely attentive. His piercing eyes fixed entirely on her, as though he'd been monitoring her breathing for hours. The cool control he was known for softened by something she had never seen in him before, genuine concern. Her heart lurched with embarrassment as she realized she had fainted in his arms, like someone who had no strength left at all, and she tried to push herself up, hands shaking as she whispered an apology that barely came out, but Paul raised a hand immediately, stopping her with a quiet authority that cut through the air like a blade, as he said in a low, steady voice, "You don't apologize for surviving." Each word delivered with a conviction that made something deep in her chest tremble because no one had defended her survival before. No one had spoken to her as if she had the right to exist and rest. He stood from the chair and approached the bed, with movements both calm and deliberate, as if any sudden motion might startle her. And before she could form another word, he picked up a tray from the side table, a bowl of steaming soup, a folded cloth napkin, a glass of water with lemon, and placed it gently across her lap, adjusting the blankets around her shoulders with care so unexpected from a man notorious for being ruthlessly efficient and emotionally unreachable. His fingertips brushed her arm for the briefest second, sending a warm ripple across her skin that surprised her with its softness, and she watched him through wide, disbelieving eyes as he knelt slightly to meet her gaze, making sure she was warm, stable, comfortable, completely at ease before stepping back just enough for her to breathe without feeling crowded. She managed a small, shaky sip of the soup, the warmth sliding down her throat like a lifeline, and the sensation unraveled the composure she'd been trying to hold together. Tears welled up again, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming shock of someone actually caring, and Paul's eyes flickered at the sight, jaw tightening slightly, as if the very idea of her crying stirred something in him he wasn't prepared to confront. When he finally sat down again, his elbows resting on his knees in an uncharacteristically relaxed posture, he didn't bombard her with questions or pity. He simply watched her with steady patience, as if waiting for her to trust him without forcing it. The silence between them wasn't cold. It felt strangely safe, heavy, with things unspoken. Eventually, Olivia exhaled shakily and began talking, halting at first, her voice fragile as she explained the apartment eviction, the financial struggles, the betrayal from Tyler, the crushing sense of having nowhere to go, and the shame that drowned her daily. Paul listened without interrupting, without a single flicker of judgment, but with a darkening intensity that grew with every word, his jaw clenching tighter, his muscles tensing in slow, controlled increments, and Olivia could tell something inside him was reacting, something protective, something sharp, something dangerous that wasn't aimed at her. As she continued, her hands trembled around the soup bowl, and he gently took it from her, placing it aside before she could spill it, the movement instinctive, attentive, almost intimate in the way he took responsibility without asking permission. His eyes never left her face, and the more she revealed, the more his usual corporate composure cracked, revealing a man who was trying very hard to stay calm, but failing with every new piece of her story. When she admitted that Tyler had left her on the street while pregnant, offering her nothing but cruel words, something shifted in Paul visibly. His brows lowered, his posture straightened, and the faint warmth in his eyes hardened into something colder and infinitely more dangerous. He pushed to his feet abruptly, the chair scraping lightly across the floor as he rose with the power of someone used to stepping into action, his jaw set like granite, and for a moment Olivia felt a sharp panic, unsure if she'd said too much, unsure if her vulnerability had made him uncomfortable. But then he turned to face her fully, and the storm gathering behind his eyes made her breath catch. All traces of gentleness evaporated, replaced by a glare so intense it sent a shiver up her spine, not because she feared him, but because she sensed that this man, this controlled, calculating CEO, was seconds away from unleashing a fury on someone who had deeply wronged her. He stepped closer to the bedside, his voice dangerously low but calm enough to be terrifying as he asked, "Tell me his name." The softness completely gone, his tone no longer soothing but sharpened into a blade of pure, focused intent. The lamp beside him flickered, casting his shadow long and tense across the wall, making him look even more menacing. Olivia's breath hitched, sensing the shift in the air as if something pivotal was about to happen. Main cliffhanger. Paul's voice dropped colder as he repeated, "Tell me his name," and the last trace of gentleness vanished from his face. The silence left behind after Paul's demand still clung to the room like a second layer of air, thick and pulsing with tension, and as Olivia stared up at him with wide, tired eyes, she felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing between them, a heaviness that didn't belong solely to her. Paul stood over her with his spine rigid, his fists coiled at his sides, his breathing steady but strangely uneven beneath the surface, and when she whispered shakily that saying her ex's name wouldn't change anything, something in him faltered, not visibly at first, not dramatically, but in a tightening around his eyes, a pull at the corner of his mouth, a subtle collapse of the icy authority he always carried like armor, as though her refusal had hit a part of him that wasn't anger, but memory. His gaze softened for half a second before hardening again, but Olivia caught the flicker, an echo of a much older hurt, one he clearly wasn't accustomed to letting anyone see. He didn't argue. He didn't force the name out of her. Instead, he simply stood there, staring at her with an expression that felt almost too raw for a man like him. An expression that told her he knew abandonment far too intimately, not in theory, but in the kind of lived experience that leaves permanent shadows behind the eyes. A long breath slipped from him, quiet and controlled, and he finally stepped back from the bed, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, like a man collecting himself after nearly exposing a truth he'd sworn to bury. Olivia watched him walk toward the door with a posture carved from discipline, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed something storming underneath, and before she could say anything, he left the room without slamming the door, but without the quiet grace he usually carried either. It was the walk of someone who needed distance before emotions cracked through the surface. Hours later, when exhaustion pulled her into sleep, she expected solitude, darkness, and silence, yet something in the air felt unsettled, as if Paul's emotions had seeped into the walls. When she woke again, deep into the night, thirsty and disoriented, she slipped carefully from the bed, the mansion dimly lit by faint hallway sconces, casting warm shadows across the polished floors. She moved quietly, almost tiptoeing, unsure if she was even allowed to wander, but when she opened the door, her breath froze halfway in her chest because Paul Lancaster, powerful, untouchable, intimidating Paul, was sitting on the floor right outside her room, elbows braced on his knees, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his tie discarded entirely, his hair pushed back with the exhausted frustration of someone who had run out of ways to pretend he wasn't worried. The sight stunned her. CEOs didn't guard doors. CEOs didn't sit on cold hallway floors in the middle of the night. CEOs didn't choose to be walls for people who weren't theirs. Yet there he was, positioned like a silent sentinel, and when she whispered his name, timid, cautious, uncertain whether he'd be angry he'd been caught, he looked up instantly, not annoyed, not embarrassed, but alert in a way that was entirely instinctive, as though he had been listening for the smallest sign of distress, as though he had been ready to act at the slightest sound. The moment his eyes landed on her, Concern flashed across his face, so quick and so genuine, it struck her harder than any gesture he'd offered earlier, and he rose to his feet in one smooth movement, stepping toward her with the quiet urgency of someone who feared she might collapse again. Olivia felt heat rise in her chest, not because Paul was close, but because she finally understood something she hadn't realized yet. Loneliness clung to him like a shadow, woven into every rigid line of control he wore like armor. The man who commanded boardrooms and dominated industries stood before her now with a vulnerability he didn't speak of, one carved into him long before tonight, and she saw it clearly in the slight downward pull of his eyes, in the stiffness of his shoulders, in the way he seemed afraid to be too close, yet more afraid to leave her alone. Their connection deepened quietly in that dim hallway, not through dramatic confessions, but through stillness, shared air, the silent exchange of unspoken understanding between two people who recognized brokenness in each other without needing explanations. Paul didn't ask why she was awake. He didn't judge her restlessness. He simply offered the smallest nod toward the kitchen, as if giving her permission to walk beside him without feeling like a guest or a burden. She followed, each step slow, careful, and when she glanced up at him, she caught the way he kept pace with her, matching her speed, adjusting his stride without comment, tuned in to her comfort, without even thinking. Inside the kitchen, the mansion felt different at night. Less intimidating, warmer, shadows softer, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Paul stood near the counter, but didn't touch anything, waiting for her to move first, not wanting to overstep, yet staying close enough to catch her again if she wavered. A strange comfort settled into her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in months, maybe years, and when she finally met his eyes again, she saw a reflection of something she couldn't name. Gratitude, worry, restraint, and a hint of something deeper, something he didn't know how to handle. She opened her mouth to thank him, but before she could speak, a sudden shift in the atmosphere cut through the quiet, a movement so faint it almost blended with the night wind. Almost. Paul noticed it too. His body tensed instantly, head snapping toward the window with a sharpness that sent chills down her spine. Outside, a shadow lingered. Still, deliberate, far too close to the mansion for coincidence, a shape neither wind nor darkness could fully disguise. Olivia's pulse spiked as the silhouette held its place a second too long. Paul stepped in front of her without hesitation, blocking her view with his body. The shadow shifted again, slow, purposeful, watching. Something, or someone, was outside the window, lingering far longer than any stranger should. Olivia's eyes snapped open in the middle of the night, her chest heaving with a force that left her gasping as the remnants of a nightmare clung to her like icy tendrils, dragging every nerve into tension, every muscle into trembling. And for the first few seconds, she wasn't sure where she was, whether the walls around her were real, whether the warmth that brushed her face was tangible or imagined. Her hand flying to her belly instinctively to protect the small life inside her, every heartbeat in sync with the panic rising uncontrollably through her system, and before she could gather herself, before she could even force her legs under her, the faint creak of polished wood on the floor announced his presence, and Paul Lancaster, impossibly quick and impossibly aware, was already kneeling beside the bed, his long coat discarded somewhere behind him, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight, eyes blazing with a fierce intensity, softened by the rarest hint of gentleness, the kind of look that made her pulse flutter with both comfort and caution, as if he carried the weight of the world yet chose, at that moment, to carry her in it. His hand pressed firmly to her back in a grounding motion, careful, deliberate, radiating warmth that seeped into her frozen nerves and anchored her trembling body to reality, and she felt herself slowly uncoiling, though the nightmare's grip remained, whispering memories of betrayal and fear that threatened to pull her under again, reminding her of Tyler's cruel absence, reminding her that safety had always been a fleeting illusion, reminding her that the world outside these walls was cold, unfeeling, and dangerous. And yet here he was, a man whose life seemed to revolve around power, control, and calculation, offering her none of those, offering only presence, care, and protection without question. He hesitated for the briefest moment before reaching for her hand, his thumb brushing the skin with a gentleness that contrasted the sharp edges of his features, the firmness of his hand revealing both caution and a deep, unspoken need to protect her. And when she didn't pull away, when she allowed herself to meet his touch halfway, their fingers intertwined, the contact sending a ripple of warmth and reassurance through her, a silent language of safety, a promise she hadn't dared to imagine in months. He murmured words that barely broke the darkness, low, guarded, cracked, fractured, laden with truths he hadn't shared with anyone, his voice carrying fragments of a pain he kept buried beneath the walls of his impeccable composure. And yet she felt it all, felt the weight of his wounds brush against her own vulnerability, felt the understanding that passed between them without a single syllable fully formed, felt the strange, quiet intimacy of two souls recognizing the fractures in one another and choosing nonetheless to stay close, to hold, to be present. Olivia's head leaned slightly into his chest, seeking the warmth, seeking the grounding, seeking the anchor he offered without expectation, and the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat pressed against her temple, steady and strong, became a tether that slowly untangled the panic coiling in her lungs, allowing tears she had no control over to slip down her cheeks, hot and sharp against the cool night air. And he didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't attempt to hide the concern flickering behind his normally impervious gaze, but simply adjusted his hold to support her trembling, letting her know in silence that she wasn't alone, that in that fragile moment she had a place to rest, a place to be seen, a place to matter. Outside, the mansion seemed to lean into the night, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the walls, the faint hum of distant traffic and the creak of settling floors accentuating the intensity of the space around them. And just when she began to relax, just when her pulse slowed and her breathing started to even, a sharp vibration cut through the darkness, startling both of them. The unmistakable buzz of Paul's phone against the nightstand, urgent, insistent, and foreign in its interruption, breaking the sacred cocoon of safety they had shared for a heartbeat too long. Paul's body froze instantly, his entire frame coiling with alertness, every muscle taut, jaw clenched, eyes narrowing into a glare, sharpened by instinctual awareness of danger. And Olivia felt her stomach knot as he reached for the device, thumb hovering over the screen like a soldier assessing a threat before engagement, a flicker of something unspoken crossing his face that made her realize the moment of solace was temporary, fleeting, and that the world beyond the walls of the mansion had already infiltrated the fragile safety they had built together. The glow of the phone reflected off his piercing eyes, revealing a tension she had never seen before, as if the threat was closer than she could imagine. A faint shadow moved across the edge of the hallway, imperceptible yet deliberate, and she held her breath, sensing the same instinctual vigilance Paul had instantly adopted. The wind rattled the window panes suddenly, slicing through the room, carrying a sound so subtle she couldn't place it, but felt in her chest like a warning, a signal that they were no longer alone. His voice dropped low, controlled, almost deadly in its intensity as he muttered a single phrase she could barely hear, yet it pierced her nerves. "Someone is watching the property." The words hung in the room like a knife, sharp and real. and Olivia's body stiffened. The warmth she had felt moments ago replaced with adrenaline, fear, and the undeniable awareness that the fragile cocoon they had been wrapped in had been breached. Her hand instinctively tightened around his arm, seeking grounding, seeking protection, seeking confirmation that he wouldn't let the danger touch her. And he responded by pressing a reassuring, fierce grip against hers, his eyes scanning the dark edges of the room, ears straining for the faintest sound, posture rigid but poised to act, ready to defend her at any cost, every line of his body radiating authority, power, and a deep, personal commitment she had never dared hope for. The phone buzzed again, insistent, and Paul's gaze hardened into a lethal determination, the shadow outside the window still lingering. And in that single charged moment, Olivia understood with chilling clarity that the night was far from over, that their fragile intimacy had collided violently with the reality of someone who wanted to hurt them, and that in a heartbeat, their lives, together, fragile and newly bound, could be shattered in ways she was not ready to face. 5. The night stretched on, and Paul barely slept, pacing the darkened hallways of his mansion with the weight of vigilance pressing against his chest, every step measured, deliberate, every breath taken with the awareness that Olivia's safety rested entirely in his hands, a responsibility he had never expected but now could not relinquish. As he watched security feeds flicker across multiple monitors with his sharp eyes scanning for the smallest sign of threat, the faintest movement, the slightest shadow that might suggest danger, every alert and camera angle analyzed with precision, honed from years of commanding corporations and fending off rivals, yet none of that training had prepared him for the fragile human vulnerability that now consumed him, for the way his chest tightened every time he thought of Olivia alone, trembling or afraid, and for the way the rhythm of his own heartbeat had synced with hers in ways that startled him into a strange foreign tenderness he didn't know how to name, pacing like a caged predator who had discovered an unexpected weakness in his own defenses, a softness that he couldn't ignore, a pull that threatened his composure. And when dawn broke, pale light spilling into the rooms of the mansion, it revealed him standing in the kitchen, awkward and unaccustomed to the domestic simplicity, staring at a frying pan with furrowed brows, muttering under his breath as the scent of burnt toast filled the air, fumbling with utensils, dropping a spoon, muttering apologies to the empty room as if she were already there. And when Olivia entered, still groggy, hair disheveled, eyes wide with both surprise and amusement, she froze for a heartbeat, caught between disbelief and a soft, rising warmth in her chest at the sight of him, this powerful, impenetrable man looking entirely out of place, vulnerable in a way she had never seen, fumbling to create a breakfast as if it were a battlefield he had never trained for. And when her lips curved into a small, genuine smile, something subtle but seismic shifted in him. The stern, commanding mask cracking, revealing a man unsure how to be tender but trying with every ounce of effort he could muster, the unpracticed gestures of care and gentleness spilling out in ways that made her heart thrum faster. And as he handed her a slightly burnt slice of toast, muttering something about not burning the house down, she couldn't stop herself from laughing softly, the sound mingling with the quiet morning air. And in that instant, the distance, the walls, the fear, and the shadows of the past seemed to recede, leaving only the fragile connection burgeoning between them, delicate yet undeniable. And it was in that kitchen, amidst burnt toast and half-spilled coffee, that he realized with sudden clarity how deeply he had begun to care for her, how each glance, each small smile, each subtle breath she took in his presence rooted itself into the very core of his being, reshaping the careful, calculated man he had always been into someone unrecognizably human, unguarded, and entirely captivated. From that morning onward, his focus sharpened not on boardrooms, investors, or deals, but on her and the small life growing inside her, and he began to accompany her to every prenatal appointment, rearranging schedules, ignoring phone calls from associates who expected him to prioritize work, canceling meetings without explanation, telling himself silently that nothing else mattered as he observed her gently taking the seats in waiting rooms, watching her hands unconsciously cradle her belly, hearing the soft murmurs to the baby, witnessing the beauty in her exhaustion and resilience, and every day, every small interaction deepened the bond between them. Each quiet glance, every unspoken word, the way she adjusted a blanket over her shoulders, the way she hummed softly while waiting for the doctor, the warmth in her eyes when she caught his reflection in a window, all of it building a tapestry of intimacy, trust, and a strange comfort neither had planned, yet both felt irrevocably drawn into. One evening, as the sunlight faded into a soft amber across the walls of the car during a quiet drive back from an appointment, Olivia gently placed Paul's hand on her belly, the tiny miraculous movement of the baby kicking beneath their touch, making him freeze, eyes widening, lips parting ever so slightly in awe, fingers trembling as he held still, as though afraid even the smallest motion could shatter the fragile, miraculous connection he felt in that instant, and her heart constricted with a mixture of emotion she could barely contain, watching him experience something so tender, raw, and human that it softened every hard edge he had ever cultivated. Yet before the moment could fully bloom into the peace they both needed, a sudden knock shattered the quiet serenity, the sharp sound reverberating through the mansion like a cannon, and seconds later his head of security burst through the door, urgency etched in every line of his face, voice clipped, eyes wide as he blurted, "Sir, a man demanding to see Olivia is at the gate." And Paul's body instantly stiffened, fingers tightening around the counter, jaw setting like iron, eyes narrowing with the lethal calm of a predator, aware that danger had just arrived at the threshold of everything he was beginning to protect, and Olivia's hand instinctively clutched his arm, the warmth of their shared moment replaced instantly by the icy realization that even within the sanctuary they had begun to build, shadows lurked outside, threats waited, and the fragility of their newfound bond could be tested in ways neither had expected, leaving the morning light suddenly heavy with tension, fear, and the unspeakable knowledge that their lives were about to collide violently with the world beyond the mansion walls. The security monitors flickered as Paul's gaze swept to them, registering movement just beyond the gates, too deliberate to be coincidence, and a shiver traced Olivia's spine. The faint sound of a car engine outside made the hairs on the back of her neck rise, each thrum of the engine echoing in her chest like a warning. Paul's hand pressed instinctively against her back, a grounding force, even as his mind raced to calculate every possible risk, the protective instinct burning hotter than any corporate calculation he had ever made. The words, "Sir, he wants Olivia," hung in the air like a blade, and Olivia realized with bone-deep clarity that nothing in her life had prepared her for the storm now gathering just beyond the gates of the mansion, and that Paul's feelings, intense, unexpected, and fiercely protective, were about to be tested in ways neither of them could ignore. Paul's jaw tightened the instant the words left his head of security's lips. The phrase, "He wants Olivia," reverberating in his mind with the precision of a warning bell, and within a heartbeat, the normally composed, meticulously measured CEO transformed into a storm of lethal calm, each muscle in his tall frame coiled like a predator ready to strike, the sharp lines of his face hardening into a mask of calculated rage, eyes darkening as adrenaline surged through him, and every step toward the front gates echoed with the authority of a man who would not, could not, allow harm to touch the woman who had already become the center of his world, the small life growing within her, forming a bond with him that transcended reason, making every calculated decision instinctively protective, making him aware that even the slightest hesitation could cost her safety, and yet he moved with unnerving precision, every movement controlled, yet fueled by an emotion raw and almost dangerous in its intensity, a mixture of anger, fear, and fierce, unyielding devotion. When he reached the iron gates of the mansion, the night air biting against his skin, his piercing eyes locked on a figure standing too confidently, too arrogantly, a smirk playing across the face that had once caused her so much pain. Tyler, the man who had shattered Olivia's trust, abandoned her, and left her broken on that freezing street, was now standing there, audacious, infuriating, and entirely unaware that he had just stepped into a storm far greater than his own arrogance could anticipate. And before Paul could even speak, Tyler's voice rang out, loud and mocking, carrying accusations that stung with both familiarity and hatred, each word crafted to provoke, to manipulate, to remind Olivia of a past she had struggled to survive, shouting cruel demands, calling her names, claiming ownership, claiming she owed him, the sense of entitlement dripping from every syllable, even going so far as to threaten the unborn child as leverage, his words sharp and venomous, but in the face of such recklessness, he had unknowingly crossed a line that Paul would never forgive, a line that unleashed a tempest in a man who rarely allowed himself to be ruled by emotion. Paul's response was instantaneous, explosive, his fist connecting with Tyler's jaw in a forceful, unrelenting strike that sent the man sprawling backward onto the cold, unforgiving pavement, the impact resonating through the night air like a warning shot to anyone who dared to cross him, and without pause, Paul grabbed Tyler by the collar, eyes narrowing to deadly slits, the raw intensity of his presence radiating a message no words could fully capture, and with a voice low, guttural, and trembling with controlled rage, he hissed, "If you ever come near her again, I will destroy everything you touch." Each syllable cutting through the tension like a blade, and Tyler's smug arrogance faltered, replaced by panic and desperation as he spat threats that were empty, hollow, powerless, meaningless against the force Paul had become in that instant, the security team moving swiftly to drag him away while Paul's eyes never left him, the promise of protection etched in every line of his body, every movement, every heartbeat, and Olivia, drawn by instinct, rushed toward the front, breath catching as fear and disbelief painted her expression, but not at Paul. No, her terror was rooted in the return of the man who had once destroyed her sense of safety, who had once been the source of her greatest pain. And yet in that moment, as Paul turned to face her, the storm of his anger dissipating into a furnace of protective love, he immediately cupped her face in his hands, drawing her close, the warmth of his palms grounding her, the heat of his forehead resting against hers, conveying a fierce promise that transcended words, and he swore, voice trembling in a way that revealed the depth of his emotion, "He will never touch you again. I won't let him." A declaration so potent, so raw, that it bypassed fear, bypassed logic, and reached directly into the core of her being, making her believe in the certainty of his commitment instantly, irrevocably, without question. And for a fleeting moment, the world outside, the danger, the echoes of Tyler's arrogance all faded as she melted into the intensity of his gaze, feeling the power of his devotion wrap around her like armor, shielding her, enveloping her in a sense of belonging and safety she had never imagined possible. But the night, as always, refused to remain simple. And as her breath caught in the aftermath of terror and relief, a sudden sharp gasp escaped her lips, involuntary and urgent, as she felt an unmistakable warmth and pressure she had been anticipating for months. The moment she had both dreaded and awaited, her water had broken, the sound of it sudden, real, undeniable, and in that instant, the protective calm and controlled fury that had defined Paul moments before transformed into something more immediate, more primal, a desperate, focused, all-consuming urgency as he reacted without hesitation, lifting her carefully, checking her, murmuring reassurances that were equal parts instruction and comfort, his eyes alight with a combination of awe, fear, and overwhelming love, as if the arrival of the child was a challenge, a miracle, and a responsibility all at once. And Olivia, despite the pain and shock, felt a trembling relief in his arms, knowing that while the world was unpredictable and threats loomed at every edge, She was held by a man who would stop at nothing to protect her, to defend her, and to ensure that neither she nor her unborn child would ever know vulnerability again. The mansion doors clicked with the arrival of unseen security reinforcements, boots echoing across the marble floor, alerting them both that even now the outside world had not forgotten their presence. A flash of headlights at the end of the driveway caught Paul's attention, movement too precise to be random, and his eyes darted sharply, instincts screaming at him that danger had not yet passed. Olivia's breath hitched as a sudden chill swept through the air, the wind carrying a hint of movement in the shadows, reminding them both that the night held more than what they could yet see. And in the midst of the chaos, the intimate, fierce moment of protection was pierced by the unmistakable, terrifying clarity that their lives, together and fragile as they were about to be tested in ways neither could have prepared for, leaving the mansion's night shrouded in tension, anticipation, and the unrelenting promise that nothing, no one, would ever reach Olivia without Paul standing in the path. The moment Olivia's water broke and the urgency of labor gripped her body, Paul's instincts ignited like a wildfire, raw and uncontainable, his hands wrapping around her with the precision of a man who refused to allow anything to harm her, lifting her carefully as though she were made of glass and yet carried the entire universe within her. Her face pale with both fear and pain, every shudder of her body setting his nerves on fire, adrenaline flooding his system in a way that sharpened every sense, every glance at the darkened city streets outside the mansion, transforming into a map of threats and obstacles he had to navigate for her safety. And the moment they hit the car, the world shrank into the interior. The chaos outside replaced by his singular focus. The road blurring beneath them as his foot pressed hard against the accelerator, hands gripping hers, fingers intertwined in a lifeline of protection and reassurance. Murmuring encouragement between teeth clenched against the panic building in his chest, voice breaking with a mix of command and desperation as every contraction racked her body and threatened to steal her breath away, whispering, "Stay with me, Olivia. I need you here." The words raw, unpolished, and utterly human, betraying a vulnerability he never let anyone glimpse, and in those moments, every red light, every honk, every movement of the city streets outside became secondary to the battle unfolding in the small space of the car. A battle for her calm, her courage, her safety, and ultimately for the life of the child moving within her. And he refused to let anyone, anything, or any circumstance wrest control from him, refusing to leave her side, ignoring the urgent calls of medics, dismissing the growing tension from passers-by who could never understand the storm contained within the car, each second stretching into eternity as the contractions intensified, each heartbeat measured and mirrored between them, every flinch of pain sending a jolt through him that tightened his grip and forced him to anchor her to the present. And Olivia, despite the terror and the searing discomfort, felt a strange comfort, her panic partially soothed by the unshakable certainty in his eyes, the promise of his presence, the knowledge that nothing would touch her while he breathed, while he moved, while he existed in the same space, the same moment, the same terrifying, sacred reality of birth. Hours passed in an agonizing blur, time folding in on itself, the city lights streaming past like distant constellations, while the car and the hospital became the universe, and every scream, every gasp, every tear of pain she shed carved itself into him, burning a permanent imprint of her vulnerability and strength. And when they finally reached the sterile, bright chaos of the hospital, Paul moved with a precision that belied the storm within him, carrying her through corridors, speaking softly to her, reminding her to breathe, to focus, to stay with him, each word a thread anchoring her to consciousness, to life, to him. And when nurses and doctors surrounded them, urging him to step aside, he refused, jaw clenched, body tense, eyes flashing a storm of command and desperation, as he refused to relinquish his place at her side, whispering reassurances with a voice that trembled against the sterile walls, hands never leaving hers, stroking her hair back, brushing sweat from her temple, murmuring that she was not alone, that she would not be abandoned, that he would not allow it. And then, the culmination of every pang, every contraction, every frantic heartbeat arrived in the form of a cry so small, so fragile, yet so ferociously alive that it shattered the tension in the room and replaced it with a tide of emotion that left both Olivia and Paul gasping in relief, tears streaking their faces, bodies trembling from the release, and for a moment, Paul froze, frozen in the doorway, unsure how to touch something so precious, something so miraculous, something that had emerged from her body and would now define a life that he knew he would protect with every fiber of his being, almost afraid to breathe, almost afraid to move, the weight of awe, love, and fear collapsing into him like a wave he had no ability to control, until Olivia, in her exhausted and trembling glory, whispered his name, soft, coaxing, inviting him to step forward, to participate, to claim the connection that had been forged through fear, danger, and devotion. And he finally obeyed, moving with reverence, careful hands cradling their daughter, as if she were the only object in existence worthy of his attention, eyes wide, drinking in every detail, every tuft of hair, every tiny finger, every fragile breath, every noise, a perfection in vulnerability that left him momentarily speechless, rooted to the floor in awe of the life before him and the woman beside him who had endured so much. And Olivia, exhausted yet radiant, reached for him, cupping his face, letting him know he was wanted, needed, and that in this moment nothing else mattered, that he had been enough, that he had been perfect, that his protection, his love, his devotion had been the tether that brought them to this miracle. The sudden shrill ringing of a phone cut through the room, startling them both, the sound harsh against the soft cries of the newborn, the tension immediately reasserting itself, reminding Paul that even in this moment, the world outside was not finished with them. Through the small window of the hospital room, movement flickered, shadows crossing the corridor just long enough to make his pulse spike, a silent warning that danger still lurked beyond the doors. The newborn's cry echoed against the walls, but beneath it, a low vibration from the hospital communication system indicated incoming urgency, pulling Paul's attention away from the perfection of this moment to the inevitable collision of the outside world with the sanctuary he had tried to build. And then, just as Paul held his daughter close, a nurse rushed in, breathless, urgency etched across her features, and the words that left her lips froze, both of them mid-motion. "Paul, your security team is calling. Something's wrong," leaving the room's air heavy with unspoken dread. The fragile bubble of safety shattered in an instant, and Paul's mind snapped into action. Every protective instinct, every ounce of love, every heartbeat of fear converging into a single focus, to ensure that nothing and no one would ever harm Olivia or their daughter, even if it meant standing against the world itself. 2 weeks had passed since the chaos, the fear, and the miraculous arrival of their daughter, and Olivia, wrapped in the soft warmth of a blanket and the quiet familiarity of Paul's mansion, returned to a home that now felt like a cocoon, every room infused with soft light, gentle fabrics, and the comforting scent of security and care. The chaos of the outside world momentarily held at bay by walls that now echoed with laughter, coos, and the fragile heartbeat of a life they both cherished. And yet, despite the apparent calm, a tension lingered, subtle and unspoken, as if the air itself was aware that safety had only been temporary and that vigilance must remain. A quiet drumbeat beneath the serenity, because Paul's world had always been one in which danger lurked, even in the most elegant corners, and he, a man trained to anticipate every risk, had never allowed himself to forget that instinct, even when he held the most precious things close to his heart. And so, guiding her through the grand, familiar halls, Paul led Olivia to a study that she had rarely entered, a sanctuary of calm, where the world of business, wealth, and power intersected with the intimate private life they were building. the polished desk gleaming under the soft lamplight, papers meticulously arranged as though every document carried a purpose beyond mere numbers, a significance that hinted at the life he was preparing to give her, a life of safety, certainty, and unshakable commitment. And when he gestured toward the neatly arranged stack of legal documents, Olivia's brow furrowed, curiosity mingling with a hesitant anxiety, wondering what monumental gesture he had planned this time. And with a calm yet deeply emotional voice, Paul explained, each word deliberate, tender, and weighted with the magnitude of his decision, that the documents detailed a trust fund naming their daughter as his heir, ensuring her future, her security, her every need covered, an inheritance of both wealth and protection that could shield her from any storm life might throw her way. And as Olivia absorbed the enormity of what he had done, her lips parted, tears forming, her throat tightening as she struggled to find words that could match the depth of emotion flooding her, the simultaneous awe, gratitude, and disbelief leaving her breathless. And in that moment, Paul stepped closer, his presence commanding yet soft, lowering every wall he had carefully built over decades, every mask of composure and ruthless efficiency shedding, to reveal the man beneath, the man who had risked everything to protect a woman he barely allowed himself to hope for, the man whose heart had been quietly, insistently claimed by her resilience, her courage, her very existence. And he confessed, voice steady yet vulnerable, because somewhere between that bus stop and that delivery room, you became my home. I want a life with you, Olivia. I love you. Words that landed with the weight of truth, opening a floodgate of emotions between them. Emotions neither could have anticipated, emotions that had been building in silence and small gestures, in shared glances, in moments of fear and tenderness, until now they could no longer be contained, and Olivia, overwhelmed by the sincerity and intensity of his confession, cupped his face with trembling hands, fingertips brushing along the edges of jaw and cheek as if memorizing him, and she kissed him, a kiss that carried every buried longing, every ache of months past, every tear shed in loneliness, every heartbeat that had silently called his name, and as their lips parted, she felt the strength of his arms wrap around her and the baby, a physical, unshakable manifestation of belonging, protection, and love. The three of them forming a fragile yet unbreakable bond, a family forged not by circumstance but by choice, by courage, by the quiet, relentless devotion that Paul had finally allowed to surface. And as they stood there, embraced, the warmth of the mansion and the quiet coos of their daughter filling the space, there was a peace that seemed absolute, a promise that they had fought for, survived for, and could now savor. Yet even amidst the profound relief, a subtle tension prickled the edges of the room, a whisper in the back of Paul's mind that the world outside had never truly been still, that the shadows he had battled were far from gone, and just as Olivia rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat align with her own, the familiar vibration of his phone broke the calm, buzzing insistently against the polished desk, and when he finally reached for it, the message that appeared made his chest tighten, a chill crawling up his spine as he read the words, Paul. The man watching your mansion wasn't Tyler. Someone else is coming for you. And in an instant, the serene warmth of the study and the soft cocoon-like security of the mansion was pierced by a new, urgent awareness, a reminder that the world outside remained perilous, that the protection he had built, the love he had claimed, the family he had begun to create, all of it could be threatened. Yet in the same instant, Paul's resolve hardened, his gaze sweeping to Olivia and their daughter, his heart swelling with a fierce, unrelenting determination that nothing, No one could touch them while he lived, while he breathed, while he remained in the role of their protector, the storm outside a mere obstacle to be met and conquered with the same intensity, courage, and love that had carried them to this moment. And as Olivia's hand found his, fingers entwining with his in quiet solidarity, she felt the same unshakable conviction radiate from him, the understanding that together they would face whatever came, that their bond was not just born of chance or circumstance, but forged in adversity, and now strengthened by trust, vulnerability, and devotion. And so, even as the final words of that ominous message lingered on the screen, the mansion, the study, and the life within it remained filled with hope, love, and the fierce promise of a man who would never let go, a man who had finally found his home, and a family worth defending with every breath, every heartbeat, every ounce of his being, leaving the story suspended in that perfect, taut balance between safety, love, and the inevitable challenges still lurking beyond the walls, a cinematic and satisfying resolution that left the reader both fulfilled and hanging on the edge of the next possible danger, ensuring the ending was strong, immersive, and emotionally resonant. Wow, what a journey that was. If your heart is still racing, just imagine what's coming next. Thank you so much for staying with me till the end. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this story with someone who loves drama and romance. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Beyond Color Stories so you never miss a moment of suspense, passion, and unforgettable twists. Until next time, stay tuned, stay safe, and keep your hearts open for the next story.